Picture this, the American West, 1870s. While most people think of gold rushes and cattle drives, beneath the dusty plains lay treasures far more ancient than any precious metal. Massive bones, tens of millions of years old, jutted from eroded hillsides like monuments to a forgotten world. But the race to claim these prehistoric giants would unleash a scientific rivalry so vicious, so destructive, that it nearly brought American paleontology to its knees. This is the story of the Bone Wars, when two brilliant men transformed from respected colleagues into bitter enemies, turning the noble pursuit of knowledge into a battlefield littered with dynamited fossils and ruined reputations. The stage was set in post-Civil War America, an era of unprecedented expansion and industrial growth. The Transcontinental Railroad had just connected east to west, opening vast territories previously known only to Native American tribes and hardy explorers. As survey teams mapped these new lands, they began discovering something extraordinary: the fossilized remains of creatures so massive and bizarre they defied imagination. Dinosaurs were still a relatively new concept to science. The word itself had been coined just 30 years earlier by British paleontologist Richard Owen. In America, only a handful of dinosaur species had been identified, mostly from fragmentary remains found along the East Coast. But the Western Territories promised something different: complete skeletons of giants that once ruled the earth. Enter our protagonists, two men whose names would become synonymous with both paleontological achievement and scientific scandal. Othniel Charles Marsh, a Yale professor from a wealthy Connecticut family, embodied the Eastern establishment. Tall, dignified, and impeccably dressed, Marsh had the financial backing of his uncle, the philanthropist George Peabody. His rival was Edward Drinker Cope, a Philadelphia Quaker whose approach to paleontology was as different from Marsh's as fire from ice. Where Marsh was calculating, Cope was passionate. Where Marsh had institutional support, Cope relied on his family's fortune and his own relentless energy. Ironically, these two titans of paleontology began as friends. In the late 1860s, they exchanged letters, shared discoveries, and even named fossil species after each other. Cope invited Marsh to visit fossil sites in New Jersey, and Marsh reciprocated with hospitality at Yale. The first crack in their relationship appeared in 1870, when Marsh visited one of Cope's excavation sites in New Jersey. Unbeknownst to Cope, Marsh secretly paid the pit workers to send their best finds directly to Yale instead of Philadelphia. When Cope discovered this betrayal, he was furious. Later that same year, Cope made a spectacular announcement. He had reconstructed the first complete skeleton of a marine reptile called Elasmosaurus. The creature was 45 feet long with an impossibly elongated neck. Cope proudly displayed his reconstruction to the scientific community, including Marsh. But Marsh noticed something that would humiliate his rival for decades to come. Cope had mounted the skull on the wrong end of the skeleton, placing the head where the tail should be. When Marsh pointed out this embarrassing error publicly, Cope was mortified. The real war began in 1877, when two separate discoveries in the American West promised unprecedented paleontological riches. Near Morrison, Colorado, schoolmaster Arthur Lakes found enormous fossil bones weathering out of the rock. Simultaneously, near Como Bluff, Wyoming, railroad workers discovered what they described as an entire fossil graveyard stretching for miles. Both Marsh and Cope raced to secure these sites, launching expeditions that would define the next 2 decades of American paleontology. What followed was a scientific gold rush that combined legitimate research with espionage, sabotage, and outright warfare. Marsh established his base camp at Como Bluff, hiring local ranchers and railroad workers as fossil hunters. His chief collector, Samuel Wendell Williston, was a former medical student who proved remarkably adept at both finding fossils and managing the rough characters who worked the quarries. Cope, meanwhile, set up competing camps throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. His expeditions were leaner but more mobile, allowing him to respond quickly to new discoveries. Cope often worked alongside his collectors, sleeping under the stars and personally excavating specimens with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. As the competition intensified, both sides resorted to increasingly desperate tactics. Spies infiltrated rival camps, reporting on new discoveries and attempting to poach workers with higher wages. Fossil sites were sabotaged with dynamite used to destroy bone beds rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The scientific community watched in horror as two of America's leading paleontologists descended into what newspapers dubbed the Bone Wars. Professional courtesy evaporated entirely. Cope and Marsh published competing papers describing the same species under different names, creating taxonomic chaos that persists to this day. Yet paradoxically, this destructive rivalry produced extraordinary results. Between 1870 and 1890, Marsh and Cope together discovered and described over 130 dinosaur species, transforming paleontology from a minor academic discipline into a field that captured the public imagination. The end came not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet exhaustion. By the 1890s, both men had depleted their fortunes funding their expeditions. Cope was forced to sell his fossil collection to pay debts, while Marsh faced congressional investigations into his use of federal survey funds. Every time we marvel at a dinosaur skeleton in a museum, we are seeing the legacy of this extraordinary and tragic period in scientific history. The Bone Wars remind us that behind every great discovery lies human passion, with all its potential for both creation and destruction.